I'm Ussama Makdisi. I'm the author of Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations. And I'm a professor of history here at Rice University
Serwer. I'm
in
a
Houston.
professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Well, Ussama, what are you thinking about events?
Well, actually, I think I think millions of people around the Middle East and in fact around the world. I'm ecstatic at the turn of events in Egypt, at Mubarak's downfall, and at the prospect of real change, positive change in this part of the world.
It's hard to contain one's enthusiasm, but aren't there a lot of big question marks left about who's really in control? Is Omar Suleiman still vice president or not? How will the military steer this thing? Seems to me there are a lot of question marks still.
Yeah, there are. Of course, there are many different questions. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that here we are, several weeks into historic protests that have unseated at this point two dictators in the Arab world. Something that was unthinkable 2 months ago, 3 months ago.
Do you see any real precedent for this at all?
In terms of Arab history?
Arab history.
I mean, in terms of Arab history, there's certainly been precedent for the desire for self-determination. I mean, that's been one of the constant themes of the 20th century and into this century as well. In terms of mass popular uprisings of the kind that we are witnessing today in Egypt, that I think is a new phenomenon in the sense of actually not being, in the case of Egypt, not being a military coup. Of course, there was a revolution against the British in 1919, but this kind of unseating of an incredibly unpopular modern dictator, that is unprecedented.
It's not a coup in the normal sense, but the military has taken over, and the question I've got on my mind is, can the military really afford to steer this in a fully democratic direction, or will it be concerned to protect some of its own prerogatives?
Well, I guess like any revolution, like any sort of massive change, there are various interests who are going to compete to see who comes out on top at the end. And certainly aspects of the military, there are those in the military who have a vested interest in the old regime. There are others, obviously, as you could tell from the pictures, the people in the tanks, the actual people who are the face of the Egyptian army, the soldiers. Many of these people are clearly sympathetic with the demands of the revolutionaries. And so in that sense, it's very unclear as to what's going to happen. But I don't think of it only as the military running the show. I think they're certainly a major factor, but the fact that you have tens of millions of people watching this and millions of people out in the streets, that's been the primary, the most important, it seems to me, factor in all of what's happening.
I agree completely, and I think it's very important for people to stay engaged, stay mobilized. I think it's hard to keep large numbers in Tahrir Square for much longer, but I do think that the sense that people remain engaged and won't let this thing go off the tracks is extremely important.
Yeah, I think so, and that's exactly what's been happening, right, for the last few weeks, where each day there was a sense the momentum shifting one direction, then the other direction. But the fact that people have remained in the streets and have defied, the most thuggish elements of Mubarak's regime, and on all the various attempts to either crush them into submission, to lure them with false promises. All of these have failed because people have been so mobilized. I think that is a tremendous achievement. Now, of course, you're right. We don't know what's going to happen and who ultimately will emerge from this revolutionary moment with power. But the very fact that there is this is I think what is most important. And I think it seems to me it sends a tremendous challenge to not just first and foremost to the various Arab autocrats across the region, whether Libya, whether Syria, whether any of these regimes that have been dictatorial, but also it's a huge challenge to Israel and, of course, to the United States, which has been, of course, the great backer of all these dictatorial regimes in Egypt and in Egypt in particular.
Yeah, well, my sense of President Obama is that in the end he came down pretty hard on the side of the D word, democracy. It's hard to tell what they were doing behind the scenes anyway along the way. But his last statement was really quite dramatically in favor of democracy. And it seems to me that should reverberate in the Arab world and beyond the Arab world as well. I'm wondering, who's next, or is there a next? Will this alert all the autocrats out there and enable them to take steps to block anything of this sort happening? Do you have any sense of, whether Yemen, Libya, Syria, whether any of these places are in any sense right? My sense has been no, but you know them better than I do.
Well, actually, I don't know them better than you do, but I do know, I know that we can't, as I said, I can't predict who's next or what will happen next. But I don't actually agree that Obama came down strong, very much in favor of democracy. I think what we've seen, at least what I've seen, and my interpretation of the past few weeks has been that the United States administration has been playing catch-up with the sentiments of the people. So long as the Egyptians were thoroughly repressed and were appeared to be quiescent and resigned to their fate as subjects of Mubarak's dictatorship, the United States government did virtually nothing.
Well, I think that's right, but I don't think it would have been right to try to lead the effort either. They may have been a little bit behind the curve for my taste and for yours.
Yeah.
But
you're right. I'm not saying they should lead.
To get ahead of the curve would have been a big mistake as well. The sense in which I think Obama came down strongly was his rather general statement that there are universal rights and they have to be respected. Now, he applied that in particular to Egypt, but, it's inescapable. If you acknowledge universal rights, they're universal.
Correct, of course. And that's been the great sort of contradiction of U.S. proclamations in the Middle East. On the one hand, fantastic statements about democracy, about freedom, about other universal values and rights, and then of course the practice, which has been, for the most part, opposed to those principles.
Yeah.
And so
one of the reasons I'm still concerned about Egypt, I was even involved in some remote sense in the Serbian revolution against Slobodan Milosevic, and one of the reasons I'm a little bit concerned still about Egypt is because of that precedent in which basically the demonstrators cut a deal with the security forces. And the deal was Slobodan Milosevic goes, but we don't come after the security forces. There's no accountability for the security forces. I'm smelling a slightly similar resolution in Egypt, maybe not quite as explicit as it was in Serbia. And the problem with it is that it is a cloud that has hung over Serbia ever since, because the security forces were never properly held accountable, they were never purged properly. You still have internal security forces, not the army so much, that are unreconstructed and that are really very backward-looking and have a very strong influence even on the current pro-European Serbian government. So that's kind of the background to my lingering concern about Egypt. The army in Egypt seems to me to have a lot of privileges that it's going to want to protect. And if it's allowed to protect those, this could be a somewhat incomplete revolution.
Well, I agree, of course, and that's exactly the concern, not just in Egypt, in Tunisia, and across wherever the next revolution takes place. In all these instances, the idea is not simply to change the figurehead, Mubarak in this case, but to change the actual structure and nature of the regime that governs. And if it's only a superficial change insofar as getting rid of Mubarak and replacing him with some other person who keeps intact the same kind of regime, well, then that will be certainly an incomplete and a profound disappointment.
My sense is
that we don't actually know. There's no way to predict what's going to happen, and the whole point of people out in the street is that revolutions are about exactly that which is most unpredictable.
I think that's right. That was one of the problems with Omar Suleiman. He kept on insisting on a constitutional paths, which was a path that it was hard to see how it was going to produce a really democratic revolution because the Constitution is so profoundly anti-democratic. The question now is whether the military is prepared to go along and even support a non-constitutional path, which would probably involve shoving Omar Suleiman aside and creating a new interim government with a lot of participation from outside the regime, and a really concerted effort to dismantle the regime. And I'm not sure I realize that's what most of the demonstrators want, but I'm not sure I'm seeing how that's going to happen yet.
Yeah, I don't know how that's going to happen either. I mean, but that's exactly what's at stake right now, and we'll see in the next days and weeks and months to what extent we are talking about a revolution which just got rid of Mubarak, or a revolution which really profoundly alters the nature of governance in Egypt. And it's an open question. I think that's one of the most interesting and at the same time worrisome aspects of the revolution, that it may not in fact lead to a regime change in a profound structural way. But I think another point, to go back to what we were saying about Obama, President Obama and the U.S. administration's approach to this, is that it's not just the U.S. has been playing catch-up to sentiments in the Middle East. Is that I think one of the great fears, and you see this expressed on American television over and over again, is what is going to happen to Camp David? What is going to happen, and how is Israel going to react to this revolution? And we've seen the Israeli government has been very worried about a change in Egypt. And I think ultimately one of the real questions for me, at least, is how is the U.S. government, or will the U.S. government ultimately take stock of the fact that it has been defying self-determination in the Arab world for decades, and most obviously and most pertinently in Egypt in terms of their support for Mubarak's regime. But then you can think of the Palestinians, and the entire peace process has always been based, the U.S. peace process has always been based on taking Israeli fears, Israeli security concerns into account, and then basically subordinating Arab states to those concerns, and never taking into account Arab popular democratic aspirations, or at least popular aspirations.
Well, my sense is, though, that no matter what the outcome of this revolution, it seems to me likely that it will strengthen the Palestinian voice. But frankly, from what we've seen from the Palestine papers, the Palestinian voice needs strengthening. There's not going to be an agreement unless there's some strengthening of the Palestinian voice.
Yeah, Palestinian voice. I mean, the Palestinians need legitimate authority, and it's clear from the Palestine papers that the PA, I think, no longer represents that legitimate authority. Not that I don't think it really has. And in fact, the PA has been aligned with Mubarak and Israel and the United States, and is, I think, on the wrong side of this democratic wave. Not to say that people in Egypt are focusing or are concerned right now with what's going on in the Palestinian territories, but it's very clear that the U.S. has played its cards with the dictators, with Israeli oppression, with Israeli settlement, with the Palestinian Authority, and not with Arab sentiment. And now there really seems to be a sea change in the Arab world, and it'll be fascinating to see to what extent, if at all, the U.S. will adjust its policies. And I'm worried because the U.S.'s policies in the Middle East are not based only on Middle Eastern affairs. There's also domestic aspects.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and it does seem to me that one way or another, it's not wrong to see the Egypt-Israel peace agreement, as a cornerstone of relative stability in the Middle East. And personally, I wouldn't want to lose it. And I don't think it will be lost. I really don't think what's happening in Egypt doesn't look like it's about the United States or about Israel or even about Palestine. It's about Egypt. And it seems to me quite right that Egyptians should be concerned in the first instance about themselves and their own welfare.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, that goes without saying. It's definitely about Egypt first and foremost, but before Egypt it was about Tunisia and after Egypt, it'll be somewhere else. And I think the bottom line, I think the problem, I think we go back to this Camp David issue. It's not in Egypt or in the Arab world that the issue of Camp David has arisen as a problem. It's in the U.S. media. And in fact, in U.S. government reactions, the concern has been about what is going to happen to this Camp David Accord. And I don't think anything is going to happen in the short term. I think that you're right about that. But I don't think to say it's a cornerstone in the sense that Camp David was always based upon the quid pro quo that the Israelis would be able to continue to colonize the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And Egypt would essentially acquiesce to that, which it has over the past few decades. And the U.S. has acquiesced to that. And I think that's always been the problem of the American-Israeli approach to peace, which is that it's peace between states or between Arab regimes and Israel, which has its own sort of domestic constituency, voice, etc., and denial of the Palestinians and the continual colonization of the Palestinians. And that's what's generated so much, unhappiness with the U.S. So, you said at the beginning, Obama's stand would actually may curry favor at the level of Arabs. Maybe, but there are so many other issues.
Well, it's interesting to see how we slide very quickly from a discussion of Egypt into a discussion of Israel, Palestine, Camp David. But I agree with what you said at the outset. It is simply thrilling to watch what's gone on the last few days. I think it's going to take constant vigilance to make sure it goes in the right direction, which I take to be the democratic direction. And it'll be very interesting to see how long that will take. I won't be surprised if there's another year at least of before you can really hold a free and fair election in Egypt. They may try to do it faster than that. But it seems to me that there's a need to create appropriate conditions for free and fair elections, as well as the electoral mechanism, organization.
But who determines that? That's an interesting question.
Freeing up of the media. I mean, there are a lot of conditions that really do have to be met before you can pretend to hold what I would call free and fair elections. Of course, they may do it in several stages. They may do it, elect an interim regime that rewrites the Constitution and then holds still another election. It's going to be very interesting to see how these very bright young people, along with their elder mentors, face the challenges of the transition period.
Yeah, of course, and I think it's totally a thrilling moment here, and of course one hopes that the Egyptian youth and the people who've been out in the streets demonstrating and defying tyranny can actually continue the course and see this through to the very end in terms of systematic regime change in Egypt and leading to a much more open and democratic process. I'm not sure who ultimately decides. I think it's the Egyptians themselves who have to decide what are the right moments, and it's not for any outside power to determine that. But that's what we're witnessing now. So it'll be fascinating, I think, months ahead and years ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I do hope I agree with you completely that these decisions are properly in Egyptian hands, and that one of the thrilling things here is to watch the kind of self-determination aspect of this thing.
Absolutely. And people not waiting for anyone to help them out. They help themselves out.
That's right.
In Egypt.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yes.
And
same here.
I hope we have occasion to meet in some place sometime.
Well, hopefully in a freer Arab world.
It'll be great. Good to talk with you.
Bye-bye.